Looking at our world from a theological perspective. This is the Theology Central Podcast, making theology central.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is Monday, June the 10th, 2024. It is currently 3:41 p.m. Central Time, and I am coming to you live from the Theology Central studio, located right here in Abilene, Texas. Now, if wisdom is our goal, if we really want to obtain wisdom. Now, we talked about this yesterday. I posted my sermon from yesterday where I talked a little bit about wisdom, and in some ways it's kind of an elusive concept, right? And how we define it, we can run into some serious problems with our definition of wisdom. The typical definition is the correct application or the correct use of knowledge, which would mean you can't be wise until you first have knowledge. Okay, well then how much knowledge is required before one can be wise? How do we judge that knowledge? Are you sure your knowledge is even right or even wrong? And then we talked about, well, if wisdom is the correct application or use of knowledge, well, then we got a problem because we say Solomon is wise and he did not have any correct application of that knowledge. He went against all of it, especially if we're going to say that to have biblical wisdom would mean we would have to have the correct knowledge of the things of God, which would mean we would have to have a correct knowledge of Scripture, right? Well, Solomon, whatever knowledge he had of God and Scripture, clearly he goes against it, and we talked about that. So then we kind of talked about a new definition of wisdom, or at least maybe how to limit the wisdom Solomon had, and we looked at a lot of those issues. But if we really want wisdom, and I still will agree and put forth the hypotheses that the concept is somewhat elusive, right? What is wisdom? In some ways, we have these when I say it's elusive, just try to at least understand what I'm saying, because someone's going to misunderstand. It's elusive in the sense that we have these very specific definitions, but when you really take these definitions and then say, okay, if this is the correct definition of wisdom, then we got a million problems, but nobody wants to address all of the problems that arises from our definitions. Again, if you say wisdom is the correct application of knowledge, well, then that means knowledge is a prerequisite. How much knowledge? And if someone has great knowledge, does that make them wise? We'll typically say, no. You can have great knowledge, but not be wise. Yeah, but you have to have knowledge in order to be wise. So before you start criticizing someone, you may be criticizing a wise person if they demonstrate great knowledge. But we don't really act that way. It's like wisdom is this thing that we all say we should have, but we don't really think about, well, wait a minute. If knowledge equals wisdom, or at least knowledge is the prerequisite to wisdom, that person has great knowledge. Who am I then to criticize or to attack them because they may have great wisdom, unless you believe you're wiser than them? Then it's like, how do we then judge wisdom? How do we judge knowledge? It just leads to lots of very important questions. But we can all agree, I think, or we should all desire to ultimately possess wisdom. We all should want to be wise people. And remember, there's two kinds of wisdom, right? There's the earthly, sensual, fleshly, of the devil kind of wisdom. Now, that doesn't mean it's always sinful, because just being earthly, it can just be practical wisdom, everyday wisdom. But it's wisdom that's not connected necessarily with God or anything dealing with God. It's just an earthly, sensual, fleshly, devilish kind of wisdom. And that has obviously a lot of elements of sinfulness obviously involved in it. There's that kind, right? We know as Christians, we want to move from that earthly, fleshly, sensual, devilish kind of wisdom to that which comes from above, that which is heavenly, that which is godly. We want biblical, godly wisdom. We should all want that and desire that. We want to be living our lives operating from that biblical wisdom, and that begins to control and influence our life. We all want it. But there are clear prerequisites before we can get it. So here's what we're going to do. Today is Monday, June the 10th. This entire week is dedicated to this concept, fear of the Lord. Now, I know you may say, well, wait a minute. You just spent all of that time. You spent 5 minutes talking about wisdom. Well, we want wisdom, but we cannot get to wisdom until we understand this concept of fear of the Lord. I know I thought you probably thought I was getting ready to say all of this week is dedicated to the concept of wisdom. No, all of this week is dedicated to the concept fear of the Lord. So I'm going to give you some very specific assignments for this week. Some very specific things to do. And then we're going to just talk. I'm not going to try to do too much teaching here. I've got plenty of notes that I can, but I'm going to try to just introduce this. And as always, the goal is to get you up off the couch to a table with a Bible, a notebook, a pencil, and some reference tools, and actually engage in study. That's the goal here. All right. So are you ready? Let's start with this. All right. First thing you need to do for this entire week, starting Monday, June the 10th, that is today. For the Sermons 2.0 app sermon challenge, meaning download the Sermons 2.0 app. You can do so in the Google Play Store, the Apple App Store, download the Sermons 2.0 app, and then start looking for sermons on the fear of the Lord. You can first go approach it from a topical perspective. Just type in fear of the Lord and see what shows up. Then you can start looking up specific scriptures that mention the fear of the Lord, like in Proverbs chapter 1 and Proverbs chapter 9. All right, you could look up those. There's others, but you could start right there. Okay, and you can look up individual scriptures and then find the sermons, and then just start listening to as many sermons as you can on the subject of fear of the Lord. You can do so by looking up the topic. Just type in fear of the Lord, the phrase fear of the Lord, or you can do so by looking up individual scriptures, or you can do a mix. Now, remember, write down the name of the sermon in your notebook, write down maybe the name of the church, and then write a 1-sentence summary of said sermon. Listen to as many as possible, at least one per day. Go from Monday till Sunday. All right? Fear of the Lord, fear of the Lord, fear of the Lord, fear of the Lord. As you listen, if you're going to take any notes, what you want to be looking for is there an agreed upon understanding of what the fear of the Lord is or what it isn't? Or is it somewhat kind of vague and we can't really wrap our hands around it, our mind around it, kind of like wisdom, right? Wisdom is kind of this vague thing. Like we think we know what it is, but then there's a problem. Do we really know what the fear of the Lord is? I think in many cases, maybe we know what the fear of the Lord is far better than we know wisdom. But then we have to ask ourselves then, do we really fear the Lord? But fear the Lord. That's your Sermons 2.0 apps challenge for this week. Fear the Lord, fear the Lord, fear the Lord. Make it your goal to just write it down, agreed upon, definitions, everything about it. All right. Number 2, I want you to try to come up with somewhere between 5 to 10 specific definitions for fear of the Lord. Now, this is the key. If you get from 5 completely different sources, it can be a sermon, it can be a Bible dictionary, it can be anything. Wherever 5 specifics, always write your sources down. 5 sources that define the fear of the Lord. If those 5 are from completely different sources, but they're almost verbatim the same, they're almost word for word, then okay, you can stop at 5. If you start seeing some major differences, some major variety in the way they're understanding or defining what the fear of the Lord is, then extend that to try to come up with 10. This may be one of those where you're like, well, everyone agrees. This is not even difficult. Or you may go, wow, there's some massive differences in definition. Then extend it out and then try to have about 10 written down. All right, fear of the Lord. All right, definition. So number 1, the fear of the Lord is the topic. So Sermons 2.0 app challenge is all about the fear of the Lord. Look up the phrase fear of the Lord, do it from like a topical perspective, or look up the scriptures and look up sermons on specific scriptures about the fear of the Lord. Number 2, definitions. You want to write down a minimum of 5 definitions. If you find that there's great differences or disagreements in those definitions, then extend that out to about 10. Number 3, I want you to read 2 passages of scripture. The first one is Proverbs chapter 1, verse 7, which reads, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. I want you to write that down. You can write down the whole verse. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. Have that verse down. Then Proverbs chapter 9. That's the first verse, Proverbs 1:7. The second verse is Proverbs chapter 9. Proverbs chapter 9, verse 10. Proverbs chapter 9, verse 10, where we read these words. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Proverbs 1:7 and Proverbs 9:10. Write those scriptures down. Now, once you have those scriptures written down, then here's what I want you to do. This is kind of very open-ended, and I want you to start working on these concepts, right? So if wisdom is the ultimate goal, even though it's kind of vague, it's kind of sometimes we don't may be really able to understand wisdom, and some of our definitions lead to problems. If wisdom is the goal, what I want you to figure out is then how the fear of the Lord serves as a prerequisite to it. And really, we kind of start creating a formula, right? If wisdom is the correct application of knowledge, then knowledge is a prerequisite to wisdom. You have to have knowledge in order to have wisdom. However, in Proverbs 1:7, we find out that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. So if knowledge is a prerequisite to wisdom, then the fear of the Lord is the prerequisite to knowledge. So I must have the fear of the Lord in order to have knowledge, in order to have wisdom. So here's what I want you to consider, right? Here's what I want you to consider. How is the fear of the Lord a prerequisite to knowledge? How does that work? Now, I think we may have to work on our definition of knowledge here, right? Because I know atheists who have no fear of God, and they can read the Bible, understand the Bible. In some cases, they understand it far better than Christians. They understand context, syntax, definitions. They may disagree with anything that it says, but they're able to read it and say, well, this person was, this, and this happened here, and this happened here, because the book, the God's revelation is in written form. Anyone who has basic reading comprehension skills, how to basically interpret anything that is written, understanding syntax, context, background, all definitions of words, grammar, punctuation, all of those things. They can have great knowledge. So maybe this knowledge is a different kind of knowledge, because the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. So do we say any knowledge that is obtained but does not have the fear of the Lord as its prerequisite, or what comes first? That is not true knowledge. That is a fraudulent knowledge. Maybe, but either way, I want you to just try to really summarize in your own words, and you can look up as many sources as you want on this, and maybe as you're listening to sermons, people will help you, will offer some advice here. But I want you to try to figure out, okay, we've already said that what's a prerequisite for wisdom is knowledge, since wisdom is the correct application or the right application of knowledge. So you have to have knowledge. Well, you can't have knowledge until you have the fear of the Lord, because fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. So we need to figure out the fear of the Lord. That's why I told you to write down those definitions. So you got to first look at those definitions, go, okay, I've got the fear of the Lord. Well, how is that the beginning of knowledge? I want you to really wrap your mind around this concept that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. How does that work? What is the connection what is the relationship between the fear of the Lord and knowledge? And is that just normal knowledge, or is that a unique kind of knowledge? In other words, if you have knowledge but you don't have the fear of the Lord, is it what kind of knowledge is it? Because we know some knowledge can exist without the fear of the Lord. So there has to be the fear of the Lord. Does it change the nature of that knowledge? Does it influence that knowledge? What is the relationship between the fear of the Lord and knowledge? I want you to really, really try to articulate it to the best of your ability. Again, it's kind of a vague concept, right? it's kind of this, exactly what are we trying to say here? It's kind of ambiguous. It's kind of like, I don't know. All right. So the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. All right. So what is that connection? What is that connection? I want you to really, really try to think about it. You may not have, you may spend a lot of time looking up things, reading things, and you may get yourself a little frustrated by the end. But I want you to really try to wrap your mind and see if we can grasp this. Hey, you want wisdom? Well, wisdom is correct application of knowledge. You must have knowledge. However, you can't get knowledge without the fear of the Lord, because the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. How are they linked together? And when you fear God, is that a different kind of knowledge? Because people obviously can obtain knowledge without the fear of the Lord. I want you to just struggle with all of that. But then, go back to Proverbs. That's Proverbs 1:7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. But then I also want you to work on Proverbs 9:10. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So it sounds like you can't. So it sounds like this is where it starts. The fear of the Lord or the fear of God. Everything starts there. You must fear the Lord. You must fear God, because without the fear of God, you cannot get to knowledge and you cannot get to wisdom. Now, we already said wisdom is the correct application of knowledge, but you can't have knowledge until you fear the Lord. But it sounds like you cannot have wisdom until you fear the Lord. So what is the connection between the fear of the Lord and knowledge? And what is the connection between the fear of the Lord and wisdom? Wisdom requires knowledge, but you don't get knowledge without fearing the Lord. However, you don't even get wisdom without fearing God. What is the direct connection between fearing the Lord and knowledge and wisdom? I want you to work that out. Oh, I kind of want to start already trying to take it apart and throw out some ideas. I don't know if I have any good definitive answers here. I don't know. But I want, again, the goal here is to simply present it to you to get you working on it. So here's what I want you to do. Again, the Sermons 2.0 app challenge. It's all about the fear of the Lord. You can just look up that phrase, or you can look up verses like Proverbs 1:7 or Proverbs 9:10 and look for sermons that are taking those passages apart, and just start listening. As you're listening, well, do they offer definitions to the fear of the Lord? If they do, you can write those definitions down. All right. You can also look up definitions anywhere else you can find any discussion about the fear of the Lord. All right. So make sure you get those definite. Remember, 5, if they seem to be all the same or basically saying the same thing, you can stop there. If there's some wild disagreement and differences and variations, then guess what? Try to get up to 10 definitions. Then I want you to take Proverbs 1:7 and Proverbs 9:10. Proverbs 1:7 and Proverbs 9:10. I'm going to read them to you one more time. Proverbs 1:7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. And then if we jump over to Proverbs 9:10, we read these words. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. I want you to take that concept that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And I want you to try to explain and summarize what is the correlation or connection between the fear of the Lord and knowledge. And I kind of threw out some additional questions there, like, is that a different kind of knowledge? How can you have knowledge without the fear of the Lord? Does that call into question all knowledge that one obtains but does not have the fear of the Lord? That leads to lots of questions, right? However, we know we need the knowledge before we can have wisdom, right? So we got to fear God in order to get knowledge, and that knowledge is as a prerequisite to wisdom. However, you got to fear the Lord in order to even have wisdom. So what is the correlation or connection between the fear of the Lord and knowledge? And what is the connection and correlation between the fear of the Lord and wisdom? And then I want you, lastly, if you want to write out like a paragraph, write out a couple of sentences. I just want you to really, after you've done all of that, just stop and ask yourself, do you really possess the fear of the Lord? Do you really possess it? Is the fear of the Lord a dominant part of your life? Do you really possess it? Do you really feel it? Do you really have it? Well, this is where we start. Look, we've been working on Proverbs. We want to get directly to the wisdom, right? We want that wisdom, but we can't get to the wisdom until we understand the fear of the Lord. Now, we've been working on the wisdom part, right? Because the wisdom part raises questions about why Solomon wrote Proverbs. Remember, that's kind of the original question that we struggled with, right? And we've done a lot of work on that. We looked at Solomon's background. Yesterday, we spent over an hour working on, again, the whole, do we even understand wisdom correctly? Because it raises so many questions. We spent over an hour working on it. Now, we really kind of start going, okay, if wisdom is out there and it's this kind of vague thing that we don't really understand, well, then what do we have? What are the prerequisites before we even get close to wisdom? There's all these things we have to get to before we even get to wisdom. And obviously, the fear of the Lord is absolutely a prerequisite. It's instrumental. We can't even get anywhere near wisdom without the fear of the Lord. So we have to become experts in the fear of the Lord. And that is your challenge for the rest of this week. Starting today, Monday, June the 10th, 2024. You're going to go all the way till Sunday. Now, I want to say more. I want to do teaching, but the goal is to present it to you. Now, you've got a week in front of you. You've got the resource, Sermons 2.0 app. That's a great way to start. You can look up all kinds of definitions online. That shouldn't be hard for you to follow. And then, you've got your own mind and to start working out, what is the correlation and connection here? And then, do you have it or don't have it? I mean, those are very things that you have to work on. So I really can't do a lot of teaching for you on some of those areas. All right. There you have it. Thank you for listening. You can email me, newsif@yahoo.com. That's newsif@yahoo.com. This week, we start where we have to start. The fear of the Lord. I pray that it's a great time of study, a great time of meditation and thought. Hopefully, it sparks some very interesting conversations and discussions. Everyone have a great day. God bless.